Hi everyone, since this is the last day of the exhibition, I thought I would take this time to share with you some final thoughts about the show. And I'm going to do this by quoting Lorraine Hansberry. So Lorraine Hansberry, as you may already know, was a famous playwright who wrote Raisin in the Sun. And at the time, the play was viewed, and the film was viewed as a kind of ethnographic study of Black life, at least by the general public. And so during the interview, she felt the need to clarify her position. She said that she was a realist and not a naturalist. And what she meant was that, if you're a naturalist, you just simply photograph the garbage can. But when you're a realist, you not only take into consideration what is there, but what is possible. I think through this lens that Lorraine Hansberry provides, you can better understand what this exhibition about art and democracy is about. Okay, now let's take a look at this photograph to my right by Sebastian Ridge. It's about two refugees in Pakistan. And so if you look at it from a documentary standpoint, yes, it is a photograph that's capturing the refugee experience at a particular moment in time, in this case, two young girls. But there's something about this photograph that is atypical and is reminiscent of how an artist would capture an image like this. Now, during a recent Zoom discussion, Sebastian actually defined himself as someone who is not an artist, but a photojournalist. But if we look at it through the lens of the framework that Lorraine Hansberry provided, you'll see that Sebastian really is very much an artist as well, because this image is really about hope. It's not just about what is there in a documentary sense. This is an image of hope, of girls who are smiling, who inside really believe that the future is bright, that there's a lot to look forward to. The fact that Sebastian is able to capture this, I think is amazing, and I think it's what makes him an artist. Now, I'm not able to talk about every piece in the show, but I do want to point out this work by Orna Ben-Amies, a really big sculptor who is addressing the topic of refugees in a very unique and profound way. But let's explore through the double framework of what is there and what is possible. On the surface, we see that there is a slight reference, or at least visually a slight reference to an image taken through Reuters, a newspaper, and you start to see how the artist begins to take this documentary evidence and move it a little further. The first thing she begins to do is add her own drawing on top of it. So what she is essentially is just taking something that is documentary and bringing it to life, adding a multi-dimensionality to the photo. She does it through the drawing, but then she also does it in a much more recognizable way through her use of iron to create these relief forms, these bags, or what she calls packages, that basically are receptacles of an entire life experience. And in some cases, when you're a refugee, you may not have that many belongings with you, but the belongings that you do have become all that make up your life. And so it's not just about memory, about survival, it's about what's possible. Okay, let's take a look at the photograph to my left. This photograph is by Janice Cornelis, and it documents the destruction of a library that occurred during the war in Bosnia in the early 1990s. But it's not just simply a photograph. You're not just seeing the evidence of the remains of this horrible, horrible war. The artist is actually adding something to the photo. So in this case, the doorway now contains stacks and stacks of manuscripts, which symbolically represent all of the library resources that were destroyed during the war, and kind of reconstructing it as if a way to say, hey, this is not just about what's there, this is about what's possible. It's about preserving history, knowledge, and culture, and memory. And this building actually still exists as a town hall, and it will continue to serve many different purposes in Sarajevo. So it's not just about what's there, it's about what's possible. So Lorraine's framework of naturalism versus realism, I think, is very evident in this photo by Tracy Milib. It features a protester outside the Israeli embassy. And at first glance, yes, it's very much documentary evidence of something that happened at a particular moment in time. When you think about this in a little deeper, you start to realize that there's much more happening here, right? The person who's in the forefront here, and there's very little happening in the background, is holding prayer beads. She has a cross around her neck. It is about prayer. It's about looking inwardly or to God to bring about some kind of change. And of course, we know this is all centered around the war that's happening in Gaza. But what also makes this image even more powerful, and what you can't really see in it, is that this very site is also where a serviceman set himself on fire in protest to the war. So yeah, this image is not just simply about what is there, it's about what's possible. To my right is a painting by Carter Wynn, and it's titled Lawless. And as they are working on a stoop, they're beginning to think about not only documenting a protest march, which is related to the death of George Floyd, but also how their work is tied to other movements that are happening, like the Black Lives Matter movement, but also historically earlier antecedents set by the Black Panther Party, and understanding how art has always been something that is important about bringing about change, and not just merely documentation. Of course, when also thinking about the aesthetic aspects of this, the palette and the choice of colors, the composition, and obviously there was a decision to include a Black female figure in this work. So yes, there is an artistic component to this that compels the viewer to not just think about this as a protest marcher, but as someone who's connected to a much larger reality to bring about social change. So to my left is a painting by Renee Stout, and it's titled The American Way. And in many ways, it embodies the same dichotomy between what is there and what is possible, but it does so on a much more conceptual level. So let's just take the documentary aspect of it, or in this case, the surface level aspect of the meaning of the word judgment, which is painted right in the middle of it. And it's painted to resemble neon lights, right? So on the one hand, judgment is like it's stinging, it's like it's in your face, and the way the neon is projecting it, like you're either a citizen or you're not a citizen, you're either a friend or an enemy, you're either for the law or against the law, you're either included or not included. So there's something very harsh and one-dimensional about the word judgment. And I think that parallels with how we've been defining documentation, right, or documentary evidence. But the painting, of course, is simply that. It's a painting, and it forces you to think about the word judgment on a much broader level. For example, what are the institutional or governmental forces behind the use and practice of the word judgment? What gives these judgments to power to inform and exclude? These are the types of things that come to mind when you look at Renee Stout's work. And it's very much about not only what is there, or not only what is you're thinking about on the surface, but what it means on a much broader level in terms of how judgment impacts our social practices, how it impacts the law, and how it governs our social life. So building on this relationship between realism and naturalism and how it informs our understanding of art and democracy, I want you to take a look at this photo by Patrick Drew Ryan. It's titled Exhausting. And on the one hand, you do get a sense of this very sort of documentary stance about the photo. There are a bunch of people standing on a corner, and yes, they seem pretty exhausted, capturing the moment exactly the way it is. Now we have to look at the photo through the lens of the photographer and think about what else is it about this photo that goes beyond just mere documentation. And of course, as you look at it and think about it more carefully, you realize that this is actually a protest. People have made an effort to come out to this event to protest police brutality, in this particular case, the death of George Floyd. And so it's not just merely about, hey, I'm just standing here at a protest. It's about people who want to bring about change, important change that can eradicate systemic violence directed toward Black males. So it's not just about what is there, but what is possible. To my left is this photograph by Stephen Cummings, and it's titled The Bridge. And on the surface, it's very much about documentation. There's a photo of a bridge, and there's a man before it who happens to be the artist. But beyond that, it goes a lot deeper, because when you look at it carefully, you'll see that that bridge is associated with a very important protest march that took place during the Civil Rights Movement, where protesters were attacked by police and dogs. And the protests were supposed to be making their way from Selma to Montgomery, but never made it because of the violence that was incurred. So what the photographer is doing here is actually reconstructing this documentary evidence and representing it in a way that demonstrates that history is just not merely something that occurs in the past. It's something that continues to inform the current moment. So to my left is a work by Kirsty Little, assisted by Becky McFall, and it's titled The Right Now Project. And there is a documentary component to it, as well as a component that is much larger than what appears on the surface. The artist started out by taking photos of people who had a commitment to global women's rights and also human rights in general. That's the documentary aspect of it. They used that as a point of departure to create a much larger, more social political stance. For example, they took these photos and combined them into these montages and then hung them on hangers to demonstrate this collective struggle for women's rights. And this was done in response to the reversal of Roe versus Wade, but also began to become even larger project to address human rights in general as a global concern for all citizens. The Human Right is a painting by Anthony Davis and it's titled The Pacifist. And on the surface, it's one-dimensional. You see that there's a male figure, there's a female figure. They're both painted in gray skin, what she calls her Caucasian figures. You see a question mark, you see an equation, and they appear very two-dimensional and not presented in any kind of three-dimensional space, right? So that's what's happening on the surface, but of course, if you go beyond the surface, you see that there's a lot going on here. The male figure and the female figure are portrayed very differently. One is in a dominant role, one is in a more submissive role, and it sort of alludes to the fact that the male is sort of dominating the figure. You see the woman's lungs are exposed, the male has this boxing glove. You know, there's this element of aggression, and you think about the larger aspects of the role that the men have played in society, patriarchy, and so forth. And all the other components kind of reinforce these ideas. And the more you look at it, the more ideas you come up with, right? So that's essentially what art does anyway, right? It's not just about what's on the surface or what's there. It's about what's possible and how art can be a force for change. So to my right is a work by Helen Zugabe, and it's titled Where's Banksy? Let's look at the documentary aspect of it first. What you can see in this collage are different images, photographs that appeared in a newspaper, the Washington Post, I believe, that documents war-torn regions, in this particular case, the war in Gaza. But you may not know this at first glance if you're just looking at it on the surface. But it goes a lot deeper, and you notice this right away when you start to look at the title and figure out what that means. Where's Banksy? Banksy actually is an artist who also created murals with stencils in the Gaza region in protest to the wall there. This is way back in 2005. So by saying where's Banksy, she's basically saying how do we use art to address what's happening at the current moment. So yes, this is not about what's there, it's about what's possible and how we can use art to bring attention to this crisis across the globe.